And now on with the program. We're going to delight having Dr. Hernández moderate the next panel. So I will mention briefly about Dr. Hernández, and then he will introduce the panelists. I'm happily one of them. Dr. Hernández comes to Southern as a graduate from NYU. He is also a Hispanist, an expert in Latin America, but a professor that has extensively published on film, on the avant-garde, and his papers have been presented in Europe, the United States, and Mexico. So let's welcome Dr. Hernández to do the moderating for the next table.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much for joining us for the second panel discussion with three professors from Southern Connecticut State University. I will introduce them. First. I will let them talk, and then after that, if you have any questions, we can continue with a conversation from questions from the audience and also some input or questions on my part. First, I'm going to introduce Professor Carlos Antonio Torre. Professor Torre earned degrees from Harvard University in Human Development and in Administration, Planning, and Social Policy. He is Professor of Education at Southern Connecticut State University. Professor Torre is the past president of the New Haven, Connecticut Board of Education and a fellow at Yale University, where he served 7 years as assistant dean, and he was a member of the psychology faculty. Currently, he is the president of the citywide school building and stewardship committee. Dr. Torre is an elected member of the Academy of Arts and Sciences of Puerto Rico and was awarded the Academy's Medal of the Academician. Other awards include awards given by the Society of Chaos Theory and Psychology and the Life Sciences, as well as the Connecticut Association of Latin Americanists in Higher Education. His publications include articles on nonlinear dynamics applied to education, a book-length research monograph on the triadic nature of the mind and university students' quality of thinking, chapters on educators Eugenio Maria de Hostos and Michael Apple, a chapter on teaching medicine to high school students as a dynamic way of thinking, and an edited volume on Puerto Rican migration, and currently he is working on a book on the effective ecology of education and a book on the relational aspects of education. Let's welcome Professor Torre. Next to his right is Professor David Pettigrew. David Pettigrew is Professor of Philosophy at Southern Connecticut State University, where he has taught since 1987. Some years ago, he created a course titled An Introduction to the Holocaust and Genocide Studies, Stories of Resistance, Rescue, and Survival, and teaches 2 sections each semester. As an undergraduate, he studied in Guatemala, London, and Kenya. He also co-translated 8 books and co-edited 3 books. His co-translation in 2000 of J.D. Nacio's 5 Lessons of the Psychoanalytic Theory of Jacques Lacan received the Hemingway Award from the French Ministry of Culture. He was also awarded the Southern Connecticut State University Faculty Scholar Award that same year for the translation. His 2010 co-translation of J.D. Nacio's Oedipus was named a 2011 Choice Outstanding Academic title. Most recently, his 2015 co-translation of Dominique Janicot, Heideggers in France, was selected as finalist for the 2016 French-American Foundation Translation Prize. He is co-director of a book series with SUNY Press titled Contemporary French Thought. Professor Pettigrew has authored essays that have appeared in Arabic, Bosnian, and French. Welcome, David Pettigrew, to the panel. Finally, Professor, you all know, because he's the one who organized and put together this whole thing, Professor Ruben Pelayo. He is a linguist, a literary critic, and a biographer. And for the last 20 years, his research has been dedicated to, guess what? Gabriel García Marquez. In 2001, he published the book Gabriel García Marquez, A Critical Companion. 4 years later, in 2005, Harold Bloom selected Professor Pelayo's work on the novel Love in the Times of Cholera as the opening chapter for a book of essays edited with an introduction by Harold Bloom for the collection Modern Critical Interpretations. Professor Pelayo's essays appear together with the works of literary critics he has long before admired, such as Jim Franco, Roberto González Echavarría, and Jean Bell-Villada, who happens to be our keynote speaker here today. In 2009, Professor Pelayo published the book Gabriel García Marquez, a biography. Although a third book of Gabriel García Marquez is in progress, his research is not limited to Gabriel García Marquez. He has published on art and literature in the works of Mexican writer Alberto Ruiz Sanchez, and textual experimentation in the works of female Mexican writer Sara Sefcovic, as well as the novelist Laura Esquivel and Jose Agustin. In 2014, Dr. Pelayo was awarded the Diploma of Distinguished Visitor by the city of Oaxaca in Mexico after a talk he gave on Gabriel García Marquez. The talk Professor Pelayo gives here today deals with art and literature, thought, love, and death in several short stories by Gabriel García Marquez. So welcome, welcome, Professor Pelayo. And also, I want to take this moment to say thank you very much for organizing this event. It has been absolutely well, now that we know who will be speaking for us today, why don't we begin? According to my program, Dr. Pettigrew is the first one to talk to us. So go ahead, David, you have the word now.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Okay, bienvenidos a todos. I need to also thank Rafael for his kind introduction and for the opportunity to participate in our intellectual culture. And of course, thanks to Dean Reese and Faculty Development for their support. And finally to Ruben and to the World Languages and Literatures Department for organizing and supporting the program. I enjoyed our discussions last year about 100 Years of Solitude. I was especially grateful for the opportunity to reflect on the time that I read the book while living and studying in Guatemala in 1974. At times I felt like I was living, when I was in Guatemala, I felt like I was living in the story and with the people of the book. I felt that the extended family I lived with mirrored the extended family in 100 Years of Solitude. It was a case of life imitating art that was already imitating life. But that was the discussion last year. This year I was asked by Ruben, and I was really grateful for his invitation to reflect on existentialist themes in the short stories of García Marquez. This was an interesting request. I wondered what Ruben meant by existentialism. We didn't have a chance to talk about it. At any rate, I don't think it was that important. I think he was probably just giving me some prompting for entering into the short stories. He actually recommended that I work on Eyes of the Blue Dog. I did read this story, but resisting his advice, I thought, no, I'm free to choose, any story. I read them all. I worked on all of them. I read far and wide. However, in the end, as Ruben had probably already divined, I settled with great interest on Eyes of a Blue Dog. So thanks for that recommendation. Eyes of a Blue Dog takes us, as you are probably aware, into a dreamscape. Two characters are in a dream. The man in the dream repeats the following phrase to the woman in the dream: eyes of a blue dog. She says, that. We'll never forget that. Eyes of a blue dog. I've written it everywhere. Indeed, the woman tells the man in the dream that she is searching for him in reality, apparently outside the dream, by writing the phrase, eyes of a blue dog, everywhere she can, and hoping he'll recognize the phrase and realize it is her from the dream. However, the man in the dream informs the woman that when he wakes up, he won't be able to remember the words. So we do not, on the face of it, seem to be in an existentialist register, but rather in a psychoanalytic register, or more precisely in the context of Freud's The Interpretation of Dreams, published in 1900. In this famous text, Freud proclaimed that the dream was the royal road to the unconscious, and the unconscious was the real cause of our thoughts and behaviors. With the interpretation of dreams, Freud had made an identifiable transition from his neurological and biological model of the Project for a Scientific Psychology of 1895 to the hermeneutic model of the interpretation of dreams, to a reading of representational traces, already having been set forth to some extent in letter 51 to Wilhelm Lees. Now, according to the interpretation of dreams, the patient remembers and shares the manifest content of the dream with the psychoanalyst. The manifest content is produced by the dream work itself via an apparatus of repression and distortion. The manifest content is a representation of the latent content, and as such, it is a distortion of the latent content. There is but a letter differentiating the representation from the distortion, Vorstellen and Verstellen. Vorstellen represent and Verstellen distort. For Freud, the task was to understand the process of distortion in order to translate back. So we're in the process of translation to an originary latent meaning. Those forces of distortion include condensation, classic forces or apparatus, condensation, displacement, and reversal, among others. Freud writes that the formation of dreams is based on a process of condensation. Condensation would involve the collapse of dream thoughts into dream content, or synthesis, if you will, and displacement, the transfer and displacement of psychical intensities onto new dream content with lower psychical value. This established a paradigm in which the unconscious holds the truth of the subject, and that truth surfaces in an albeit distorted form that requires translation and interpretation. Freud writes that dreams make use of symbolism with the disguised representation of their latent thoughts. Moreover, the dream work defies logic. There are no contradictions. One does not have to choose between either or. Another mode of representation of the dream involves a reversal, turning something into its opposite, including chronological reversal. Fertile ground for magical realism, wouldn't you say? For example, we read in our short story, again, she began to move toward the mirror, and I turned again in the chair, keeping my back to her. Without seeing her, I knew what she was doing. I knew that she was sitting in front of the mirror again, seeing my back. In other words, the man cannot see the woman, but he knows what she's doing due to a kind of omniscient eye in the dream that is not affected by actual location. He is here, and he is there. No problem. The man says, I see you, and she says, that's impossible. Your face is turned towards the wall. Is it possible to bring this Freudian interpretation, this classical Freudian interpretation, to the dream work in García Marquez's short story? In the story, we have access to the manifest content of the dream, and perhaps the reader, we have the dream. Perhaps the reader is in the position of a therapist who could interpret or translate the manifest content into the latent content. However, the analogy may flounder since we are never outside the dream. We have no frame of reference, no additional frame of reference. There's no outside. The woman refers to writing the phrase everywhere, I admit. She says, I would write it on napkins, scratched on the varnish of tables with a knife, eyes of a blue dog, and on the steamed up windows of hotels, stations, all public buildings. She would write it with her forefinger, eyes of a blue dog. She said once she went into a drugstore and noticed the same smell that she'd smelled in her room one night after having dreamed about me. But all that is, as far as we can tell, in the dream. We're not sure if it actually happens outside the dream. We have no evidence. In other words, we may be stuck in the dream with these two characters who are stuck in the dream. In some city in the world, on all the walls, those words have to appear in writing, eyes of a blue dog. I said, the man says, if I remembered them tomorrow, I could find you. The woman states for her part that she cannot remember where she has written the phrase, and the man responds, for the same reason that tomorrow I won't be able to remember the words. Forgetting, for Freud, is an intrinsic part of remembering the dream, or not remembering the dream. It's the relation to the dream. It's a proverbial fact, Freud writes, that dreams melt away in the morning. In our short story, the man and the woman seemed to realize in the dream that they had dreamed of each other before. We'd been seeing each other for several years. Sometimes when we were already together, somebody would drop a spoon outside and we would wake up. There's a haunting conclusion to the story where they speak of guarding against the dissipation of the dream into other dreams. So that's part of what convinces me that there's only the dream. They don't leave the dream. Don't open the door, she said. The hallway is full of difficult dreams. And as the dream ends, the man says he will recognize the woman tomorrow, in the future. But she, with a sad smile, resigns herself to the impossible, to the unreachable, since she knows he will not remember. She says, you won't remember anything during the day. And she puts her hands over the lamp, her features darkened by a bitter cloud. And it seems that all they have is the dream. But if we were to hazard an interpretation, we might say that with this short story, we are on the edge of an unattainable desire, the edge of the impossible. There is no way forward. There is no way out. This is a cultural motif that García Marquez appropriates in 1950. And it was in the early 1950s that Jacques Lacan, for example, began his weekly psychoanalytic seminars that were eventually to be published as Les Séminaires. It was Lacan who, so to speak, radicalized Freud and further dramatized the nature of the unattainability of desire at the heart of the human condition. A manque à être, as he put it, a lack in being. This impossibility was, if you will, an ontological condition, a human condition, perhaps inspired by the work of Martin Heidegger. Heidegger met Lacan when he, Heidegger, traveled to France for a conference in the summer of 1955, for the 10-day conference at Cerny. And Heidegger inspired Lacan's Agency of the Letter and the Unconscious, which was delivered as a lecture in 57. Now, in the context of Lacan's legacy, and moving towards my conclusion, I'd like to refer to another short story. So I did stray briefly into one other short story in my paper by García Marquez, namely Dialogue with the Mirror from 1949. With his bathrobe on, in front of the wash basin now, a sleepy face, hair uncombed and no shave, he receives a bored look from the mirror. The image in the mirror seems to have some unlikely or illogical agency, its own agency or existence. So I'm quoting the story. And there, opposite him, was the face with a pulse, with throbs of its own presence, transfigured into an expression which was simultaneously a smile and mocking seriousness, appearing in the damp glass, which the condensation of vapor had left clean. So in this mirrored reflection, there was a sliding of the subject, which is the original, which is the reflection. Perhaps there is at least a displacement of the tyranny of consciousness. The story unfolds within this play of images. Quote, he smiled, and in parentheses, it smiled. He showed to himself his tongue, in parentheses, it showed to the real one its tongue. The one in the mirror had a pasty yellow tongue. He smiled again, it smiled again. He smoothed his hair, it smoothed his hair. With its right hand, left hand, returning the bashful smile at once and disappearing. He was surprised at his own behavior, standing in front of the mirror and making faces like an idiot. At some point, he shaves. He begins to shave. Rapidly he brought the edge down along the right cheek, left cheek, to the meridian of the lip, and observed with satisfaction that the left cheek showed clean its edges of lather. He brought the razor backward, forward, and forward, backward, up to the corner of the mouth, to the right, left, while with his left hand, right hand, he soothed the skin. But then he sees blood in the mirror. He jumps. There's no wound on his skin. But in the mirror, the other is bleeding slightly. He thought he actually observed a cloud of worry over the hasty expression of his image. And he wonders if he could have gotten ahead of his image and finished the job ahead of it. Hence, there's a disjunct between subject and image. Could the image have taken on its own life? The face in the mirror contemplated him with large, stupid eyes, and the face was crossed by a crimson thread. But this disjunct in time and in the image of the self and the other reminds us of Jacques Lacan's conception of the mirror stage, which you may be familiar with this classic formulation from 1949, the same year this story was published. Lacan describes the mirror stage as the moment when the child looks in the mirror and sees a coherent image. The coherence or stability in the mirror is fictional, since at that stage the child's motor skills are uncoordinated, uncontrolled. Translator Bruce Fink renders this as motor impotence. I think it's over-translated. But so the child identifies with the coherent image and enjoys the fictional appearance of control, of self-control, which it lacks. According to Lacan, the child experiences a jubilation, a jubilatoire, and not jouissance, while the ego is hereafter or thereafter organized in terms of a fictional image. He writes, the important point is that this form situates the agency known as the ego prior to its social determination in a fictional direction. In this sense, the mirror image sets up a structural unattainability or impossibility, in the sense that the child can never, in reality, achieve the ideal coherence perceived in the image in the mirror. The impossibility of the achievement of desire is central to Lacan's work. In the dream, Eyes of a Blue Dog, as well, the desire to achieve the imaginary is impossible, in the sense that the man and the woman in the dream are unable to achieve their own consummation of desire. It's a pathology of desire, an impossibility. I'd like to touch you, the man says. You'll ruin everything, the woman replies. In this sense, we may be on the verge of existentialism, insofar as García Marquez is setting forth the human condition. It would be interesting, at least for me, to reflect further on the extent to which magical realism, the literary motif in the work of García Marquez, about which Ruben has been educating me since the earliest days of our interdisciplinary faculty research conferences from 1997 at SCSU. So I'm interested in the extent to which that would be inspired by or was tapping into the unconscious, thematized by Freud and Lacan. Perhaps this could be an interesting research to see to what extent psychoanalysis influenced the zeitgeist in Latin America. There's a deep appreciation of psychoanalysis in Latin America. Dr. Nazio, for example, whose books I've translated, is from Argentina. He emigrated to Paris in '69, but he studied Freud and Lacan in Argentina. At any rate, there is a lament in the eyes of a blue dog in the dream, with which I will conclude. The woman states, sometimes when I sleep on my heart, I can feel my body growing hollow. Perhaps there is a disembodiment implied in this hollowness expressed by the constriction of the heart. The source of memory, the heart, the source of memory in Italian and Spanish, Italian ricordare, and recuerdo, Spanish. Perhaps in this hollowness, there's a dissipation of the dream, a forgetting, a failure of memory, a failure of the heart, and with it, a certain hopelessness or melancholia in relation to desire. Perhaps this is the human condition, and thus existentialism returns. Thank you.
When Ruben asked me to participate again in this conference, he asked me to talk about how there is a connection between Gabriel García Marquez and education, a field that I'm passionate about and that I do 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And all of a sudden it struck me that, yes, obviously, García Marquez is an educator. Why? Because he's a storyteller. Gabriel García Marquez's books and short stories have been a long part of education in both Spanish and English literature classes worldwide and across U.S. universities and K-12 schools. In part, what accounts for his popularity is an irresistible blend of the mundane and the fantastical, while rendering real-world issues bare for all to see with crystal clarity and a deep commitment to the truth. He did not invent magical realism. He perfected it. He universalized it. As Jonathan Kendall writes in the New York Times, in his novels and stories, storms rage for years, flowers drift from the sky, tyrants survive for centuries, priests levitate and corpses fail to decompose, and more plausibly, lovers rekindle their passion after a half a century of being apart. What could be more attractive to young people in today's social environment of vampires, climate change, perpetual youth at the cost of social decay, and Donald Trump? What could be more incredible, right? But true. Seriously though, even as García Marquez has been described as a journalist, a film critic and filmmaker, political activist, author, and others, what he really is in all of his endeavors is a storyteller. Therefore, he is an educator. And storytelling is the oldest form of teaching in the world's oldest profession. I did not make a mistake. Let me read that again. Storytelling is the oldest form of teaching in the world's oldest profession. That other thing that they tell you is the world's oldest profession could not be, impossible. The oldest that that could be is most 10,000 years, and we could go into that, but this is not the forum for that. So the world's oldest profession is education. A friend of mine who, well, he died about 3 years ago, but he's a psychiatrist, he argues with me that the world's oldest profession really is medicine. And I said, well, you had to learn first, the medicine before you could practice it. So education is still the world's oldest profession. It bonded, storytelling, bonded early human communities, giving children the answers to the biggest questions of creation, life, and the afterlife. Stories define us, shape us, control us, and make us. Not every human culture in the world is literate, but every single culture tells stories. Whether in caves or in cities, storytelling remains the most innate and important form of communication. In all of us, we all tell stories. The story of your day, what happened today. The story of your life, workplace gossip, the horrors in the news. Our brains are hardwired to think and express in terms of a beginning, a middle, and an end. It's how we understand the world. So, what I want to do is, for the teachers and for everybody else, hopefully, look a little bit into how we can use Garcia Marquez's stories as a way of helping students understand themselves, because in my estimate, the purposes of education are fourfold. First, you need to help students understand who they are. You need to help them understand the world in which they live, or the world into which they have moved, or the world into which they have been born. Thirdly, you need to help them understand how to navigate that world. And fourthly, help them understand how to leave that world a little better than they found it. If you do those four things, I don't care about test scores, I don't care about anything else. Get there. We can use Garcia Marquez's bibliography, especially like Living to Tell the Tale, as a case study in human development. You know, we can teach psychology. We can teach, the human condition. We can teach sociology. We can teach a whole lot through a story like this. We can grab onto Gabriel Garcia Marquez's idiosyncratic plots to connect it to our current lives and societies. Many of our current lives and our societies are at the edge of chaos, as we know. And part of my background is nonlinear dynamics. For short, it's chaos theory. Here's something I'd love to see communities do, using schools as a center and coming up with story slams. You know about poetry slams, right? Why not do a story slam in which students have read Garcia Marquez's works in schools and discussed it and so forth, and then bring the community together, because the students can take those stories as a basis for writing their own. This is where we start making it personal, so that it becomes a real thing for them, not just some interesting story that you read on the side. The first day was magical. We got there probably around midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning. I had never seen snow, except maybe in picture books. And as we get onto the cab, my mother, none of us could speak a word of English, so she took out a letter that she had, pointed to the return address. The cabbie nodded, got us onto the cab, and as the cab moved along, it was all snowy. It was in January. Calm, it looked like gold. It looked like it was covered with a golden fleece, and it would shimmer as the moving cab with the lights and so forth. So it was magical. The next day was magical. My aunts, where we were going, took us to Lincoln Park in Chicago and said, we want to take a picture of you, so they asked me to sit underneath a tree. And not knowing, they were very young too, they were probably in their very early 20s. Two of them went behind me, and they shook the tree, and all the snow came down, and I looked like a snowman, right? And then they took the picture. So, magical 2 days. And then I went to school, and the magic stopped. And my last story is when I like to tell my students that my first class that I ever taught, I had a captive audience. And then I do a kind of dramatic pause and then say, well, it wasn't because I was so good, but because I was teaching in a maximum security prison. Right? So I literally had a captive audience. They couldn't leave. I did not start off as a teacher there. I started off as what they called an observer. Essentially, it was a buffer between the guards and the inmates. There had been a multi-million-dollar riot. Many guards had been killed. Many inmates had been killed. And so they brought in civilians. And somebody told me about it. I said, yeah, so I was like 19 years old, so that's cool. I'll go in there and, act as an observer, as a buffer between these two groups. And suddenly, and I felt very comfortable. Interestingly, when I first went to a quote-unquote a real school, I felt nervous, and I scripted everything. If I was going to cough, it was in the script. If it wasn't in the lesson plan, I wouldn't cough. Right? But I felt so comfortable. I sat with them, supposedly hardened criminals, some of them mass murderers. I sat in the cells with them. And naivete can be good. It can help you at times. And I earned their trust. And then all of a sudden, when one of their demands was met, which was they wanted classes, and they said, we finally got this demand met, and one of the biggest gang leaders comes straight at me, huge guy, huge hands, and I said, oh geez, did I put my foot in it? And with this huge hand, he taps you on the shoulder and goes, this is the guy I want to teach that class, because he treats us like human beings, right? And I said, well, interesting. If it works with so-called hardened criminals, don't tell me it's not going to work in kindergarten. Don't tell me it's not going to work with high school students. Don't tell me it's not going to work with a gang member on the street. And so, pulling all this together, when I started reading Gabriel García Marquez, all of a sudden it made sense to me. And so, one of the things that I do in my teaching is to bring these experiences and have students bring their own experiences, read some of these stories, and then write their own stories. And lastly, I want to say, I just want to ask the teachers or anybody out there, have you been able to teach with these stories, with Gabriel García Marquez's stories, and what interesting things have come back from your own students? Does that make any sense to anybody? Yes? Would you mind saying a little bit about it? You were shaking your head. Oh. Okay. Yes, sir.
I hadn't thought of it before, but I work with inner city students in Bridgeport writing their comment applications in which they have to tell their own stories. And many of the stories, many of the students are new to the United States. My favorite story is a story called Bringing Up My Parents. It's magical realism in my mind because mom was 12 and dad was 14 and totally irresponsible. And it's one of the most interesting essays I've ever read in my life because it's almost unreal, although it is real. The student learned to speak English first. Her parents did not. Dad was an addict. Mom did other things that are unmentionable. And it's just a mixture of real and unreal, and this girl survived, has now completed college, but all the stories that these kids tell in a city situation have got such a personal, wonderful voice that I'm taking your idea and I'm going to use it in the next round.
Thank you, I'm so glad. One film that I would recommend that does that very well, it doesn't have to do with Gabriel García Marquez, but it's Freedom Writers, and I say that purposely so not to confuse with Freedom Writers, in which she is totally naive. Again, naivete can be good at times, but when she realizes they have no idea what the Holocaust is and so on and so forth, she makes the connection between their gang activity, their lives, the social, economic, social, emotional kinds of situations and what was going on during the Holocaust. If we can make those connections with Gabriel García Marquez's stories, our students will grab that baton and run with it. We do not have to push them. We do not have to, force them, oblige them to try to read these kinds of things. They will run with it. And so my final comment here is that oftentimes we have so many incredible stories from our own students which we never even tap into. And to make connections with literature, to make connections with all of the other subject matters that they need to be doing. I think if we have our students write their own stories after having read some of García Marquez's things to kind of get some pointers, I think these stories will be much more García Marquez-esque, if there is such a word. I just made that up. I don't know, somebody, and compelling.
Connection.
Okay. And contribute to social change better than anything Hollywood has been throwing out to us. Thank you.
I'm going to continue with what David started. I think our whole conference is very cohesive. Obviously, it's all about one author, and also we're all talking about short stories. And I decided that for my presentation, I was going to pick up Eros and Thanatos, because Garcia Marquez happens to be in love with love and death. And to spice it up a bit, probably decided that I would like to do art as it's observed in literature, because it's also something that it appeals to me greatly. So that's what I'm going to talk about. And my talk derives or takes off from an epigraph that I particularly like, from Octavio Paz, and you can see it on the frame on the screen. Death is inseparable from pleasure, and Thanatos is the shadow of Eros. Turn aside from reproduction, eroticism creates a realm apart, ruled by a dual deity, dual-natured deity, the pleasure that is death. So that combination, it is going to frame my work along with art and literature. The juxtaposition of the imagery in the epigraph, love versus death, the individual idea of Thanatos shadowing Eros as if in a dual-nature deity, is preeminent in the works of Gabriel García Marquez. The pleasure that overrides the imaginings found in his book, Strange Pilgrims, and in all three previous short story collections, defines death and vice versa. So I'm not only interested in the obscurity of his writing, but also in the lightness of it. Gabriel García Marquez published a total of 41 short stories, nowadays available in 4 volumes. They are No One Rise to the Colonel and Other Stories, Leaf Storm and Other Stories, and Innocent Herendira and Other Stories. Those, as you can tell, were compilations. And only Strange Pilgrims was published as a self-contained book, and the translator of Strange Pilgrims was none other than Edith Grossman, with whom we spent the first Gabriel García Marquez conference last year here at Southern. In this, our second decade of the 21st century, the English-speaking world continues to pay attention to Hispanic culture, Hispanic issues, and the literature published by Hispanic writers. The trend started taking on international shape in the 1940s and 50s, but the veritable explosion occurred in the 1960s. The increased attention to Latin American letters was given to the novel, even if it started with the short stories of Jorge Luis Borges. By the 1970s, the Spanish-American names of the literary boom, namely Julio Cortázar, Carlos Fuentes, Mario Vargas Llosa, and Gabriel García Marquez, became ubiquitous with Latin American literature. But no matter how groundbreaking the work of Jorge Luis Borges was and continues to be, and how experimental and well-received were the stories by Maria Luisa Bombal, Julio Cortázar, and Carlos Fuentes, the one name that resonates the most amongst English-speaking readers is that of Gabriel García Marquez. The wealth of the short story tradition in Latin America, González Echeverría states, shares in the fabulous richness of its literature and art in general. Furthermore, he notes, and I quote, "It belies those who would naively equate economic underdevelopment and political instability with artistic poverty," end of quote. García Marquez, as an author, has influenced the work of Toni Morrison, Salman Rushdie, and Mo Yan, 2 of them Nobel laureates. And it's great to have the experience of having Dr. Fanier here with us today, because he just spoke about Mo Yan in his presentation. And well, what did we know about Mo Yan until recently in 2012, and all because of this great author from Latin America who happened to be in a Chinese repertoire, and their Nobel Prize quotes, "I am influenced by this Colombian, Gabriel García Marquez." The wealth of the short story tradition in Latin America is very well known. If Gabriel García Marquez had never put any of his novels to paper, writes another outstanding critic, Bell-Villada, also here with us today and about to take the podium in a minute, his shorter fiction would have still gained him a niche in literary history. Bell-Villada puts García Marquez in the company of such acknowledged masters of short story fiction as Chekhov, Mann, Joyce, Cuvier, and Grace Paley. García Marquez was immensely popular in the Spanish-speaking world just before the end of the 1960s. In the 1970s, his popularity increased, but by the 1980s, the Colombian-born writer was one of the biggest names in the world of literature, and his works found circulation in all leading languages. It was as if he had been propelled into a literary orbit from a Hispanic sphere, love that word, all his own, almost as if Latin America depended on his monolithic representation. Now, talk about magic realism. Dr. Vanier led us to the Golden Age writers and talk of Quevedo. And I decided, well, I'm going to talk about Eyes of a Blue Dog that David spoke so eloquently. And here I am making another bridge, another connection. There was Vanier, there's Dr. Pettigrew, and then here I come. The Eros Thanatos combination found in the short story Death Constant Beyond Love from the 1978 collection Innocent Rendira and Other Stories reaches the highest poetic form and shows that García Marquez had indeed undergone a strong Hispanic influence. García Marquez takes a 17th century Spanish Baroque sonnet and subverts the role of Eros in favor of Thanatos to create his tale. Francisco de Quevedo's sonnet is entitled Amor Constante Más Allá de la Muerte. That is to say, love constant beyond death. For Quevedo, love will survive death. The great Spanish poet enjoyed wordplay. He delighted in the use of contrasting words in a witty manner to make contradictions. It is a good portion of what we know as conceptismo. This plays on words and contradictions of the Spanish Baroque and García Marquez surface as the absurd and increased use of satire. The eternal love of Quevedo's sonnet, Love Constant Beyond Death, is inverted and subverted to death constant beyond love. The inversion of the nouns love versus death brings together the contrasting contradictions of the Baroque and the absurdity of modern times. In either instance, whether Quevedo's sonnet or García Marquez's tale, what we have is a song to love while dancing with death. Time equals death, and time will take us all, sooner or later. While García Marquez made the connection with Quevedo, we can see Eros and Thanatos connected by time through the paintings of Peter Paul Rubens and Francisco de Goya, known as Saturn devouring his son. The Romans equated the Greek god Kronos with Saturn. Goya's painting, horrid in its depiction of death, shows clearly how time, Saturn, devours his offspring. Goya in turn, was inspired by Rubens' earlier depiction of the same subject matter. Continuing with the junction of art and literature plus the idea of Eros and Thanatos as one deity, we may have to regress in time to Garcia Marquez's years of juvenilia and look at Eyes of a Blue Dog. Now, we heard David. David was splendid in his analysis of dreaming. Let's look at this story through ambiguity in art. So we went from existentialism, Freudian and Lacanian theories. Here we are looking at art. You as an audience may question the title of the short story, Eyes of a Blue Dog. You might be wondering whether this is a dog with blue eyes, perhaps a Great Dane, a Samoyed, a Weimaraner, or an Akita. How about simply conjuring up the image of a blue dog as if in a surrealist painting? The story, however, we find out, has nothing to do with a dog, but with a phrase that serves as the axis for a loveless story of boy meets girl connected through dreams. It was as if I had read David's paper, except that he never shared that with me until this afternoon. An unequivocal sign of the surrealist movement that influenced European and American artists who set off to depict a dreamlike world. From Eyes of a Blue Dog, we can draw comparisons with Picasso's monochromatic blue period, when the Andalusian-born painter painted images exclusively in a blue and blue-green around the turn of the 20th century from 1901 to 1904. Picasso indeed has a painting titled Blue Dog. It's the one you saw before, and several portraits with dogs. Art lovers, however, may pick up on the analogy and connect the title with the work of American artist George Rodriguez, who painted only blue dogs by the start of the 1990s. The collection of Eyes of a Blue Dog shows a young writer experimenting with both forms and content influenced by Kafka, Woolf, and Faulkner. The maturity of these three writers was precisely what Garcia Marquez wanted for himself. At that time, when Garcia Marquez is writing Eyes of a Blue Dog, and the dialogue with the mirror that David also mentioned splendidly, Garcia Marquez was only 23, and he was fascinated with experimentation. The maturity of these authors is what he wanted. All three authors were influential in their use of interior monologue, psychological time, sexuality, ambiguity, satire, irony, the absurd. Let's keep in mind the absurd in language experimentation. The experimentation in Eyes of a Blue Dog was almost superior to the will to tell a story. This makes some of the plots in the book difficult to follow, and my students normally have a difficult time with the book, and then they end up telling me that's the one book that I enjoy the least. Eyes of a Blue Dog is a book without love, or at best, tinged by imaginary love. The collection Strange Pilgrims is fundamentally autobiographical. Other than the age difference of his sons Rodrigo and Gonzalo, who serve as models for the children in some of the stories, he brings in some of his friends as characters or references. In the story, I Sell My Dreams, wonderful story, David discovered it, we'll probably go back to it because of dreaming. Pablo Neruda and the omniscient narrator talk about dreaming of being dreamed, which is one of the themes of Eyes of a Blue Dog, and then cleverly argued that this is something Borges would have already written or soon will write as one of his labyrinths. Even Neruda's third wife, Matilde, is part of the witty storytelling. Of all the stories in Strange Pilgrims, The Trail of Your Blood and The Trail of Your Blood in the Snow is the one that best frames the combined magic of love and horrors of death announced in the title of my talk. On the other hand, it also grants a substantial opportunity to prove that this collection is more autobiographical than the first three. The Trail of Your Blood in the Snow foreshadows, in Kafkaesque Marquesian style, something tragic to come from the opening sentence. I quote, "At nightfall, when they reached the frontier, Nena da Conte realized that her finger with the wedding band on it was still bleeding." End of quote. Nena is beautiful and her husband Billy is described as handsome as well. They are young, gorgeous, wealthy, members of the Colombian aristocracy and are about to celebrate their honeymoon in Paris. The irony, however, is that Nena is 2 months pregnant, although married only 3 days. Their wedding, to a certain extent, reflects the marrying of the couple in love of the time of cholera. They married in Cartagena, I quote, to the astonishment of his parents and the disillusionment of hers, and with the personal blessing of the Archbishop. If you are interested in biography, it's supposed to be inspired in the love story of García Marquez's parents, and then, of course, fictionalized. But their young love and their wedding vows were not meant to last. The combination of the absurd, the language limitations of Billy, and the strict regulations of a French hospital led Nena da Conte to death 60 hours after being admitted to the hospital's intensive care unit from her having pinched her ring finger on a rose thorn. Billy's solitude is complete isolation and frustration for not understanding the French language or its culture, a projection of García Marquez, whose linguistic skill in French at the time was limited. We know that the best way to know a writer to a certain extent is through his or her writing. Gabriel García Marquez on occasion said that one has 3 lives: a public life, a private life, and a secret life. We learn through the strange pilgrims of the age difference of his 2 sons, of his friendships, of his European travel, of his passion for music and art. But we could not have decoded on our own as ordinary readers is that the Trail of Your Blood in the Snow is somewhat autobiographical. In Gerald Martin's Gabriel García Marquez's Alive, we encounter the following. By association, Nena da Conte is fictionalized after a Spanish girl named Tacha, with whom García Marquez had a romantic interlude and with whom he shared his life at the time. The drama at the hospital and the Trail of Your Blood in the Snow correlates with Tacha's abortion at Maternité Port-Royal, where she spent 8 days. She was 4.5 months pregnant. It was she tells the biographer, who wanted the abortion. She lived to tell the tale and relay it to Gerald Martin. The death of Nena da Conte, on the other hand, is symbolic. She dies in the fiction, as did the relationship that García Marquez had with Tacha in real life. In closing, it bears mentioning that Gabriel García Marquez, the storyteller, this takes me back to Dr. Torre, was also well known as a journalist and screenwriter. He is a global writer of unimaginable mythical proportions. The value of his writing goes far beyond literary impact. First editions of his works are objects of consumerism and are subject to thievery, as was the case during the recent Bogotá, Colombia Book Fair. In 2015, during the event meant to honor García Marquez on the first anniversary of his death, A signed copy of the first edition of 100 Years of Solitude was stolen. The BBC and the national Hispanic newspapers reported the case as they might have reported the theft of Picasso. The book was later found with the help of Colombia's National Police Force. Today, a copy of the first 8,000 original copies published by Editorial Sudamericana in 1967 can sell for as much as $23,000. The master of magic realism died on April 17, 2014, but his spellbinding narrative will live on, as will the traces of his private life and public life, which are as fascinating as his fiction. His career as writer and storyteller belongs to the ages. Dictionaries one day will register the adjective Marquesian to describe his characters and their temperament, as when we write in Spanish, Quevedesco or Quijotesco and Dantesco. In English, we have Kafkaesque, Dickensian, and Shakespearean to refer to the writing style or the characterization in the writings. In the not too distant future, in addition to Marquesian, we will also have Marquesianized as analogous to Shakespeareanized when treating characters in the manner of García Marquez. Thank you for listening.